The starter's pistol cracked like thunder across Memorial Stadium in Columbus, Ohio. 8 runners exploded from the blocks in lane assignments that had been debated all week. But all eyes were on lane 4 where Marcus Doyle crouched in perfect position, his fingertips pressing against the warm rubber track. The crowd of 12,000 fell silent except for the rhythmic pounding of spikes against synthetic surface, each stride echoing off the concrete bleachers like a heartbeat amplified. Marcus felt his chest tighten as memories flooded back. Years of kids pointing and whispering slow Marcus, the physical therapy sessions where he couldn't even walk heeled two-toe without stumbling. The doctors who said his motor development delays might never fully resolve. The state championship 100-meter dash had come down to this moment, and everything his family had sacrificed was riding on the next 10 seconds. His mama had worked double shifts at the Ford plant in Dayton for 3 years to pay for the specialized training, and his little sister Keisha had given up her own track dreams to help him get here. The entire city of Riverside population, 8,400, had shut down to watch their unlikely hero take on Cameron Lightning Rodriguez, the undefeated phenomenon from Cleveland East who hadn't lost a race in 2 years. Marcus could feel his legs responding differently than they had in elementary school, when simple coordination drills left him frustrated and exhausted. But now his muscles fired in perfect sequence as he hit the 40-meter mark. With Rodriguez, Marcus realized this wasn't just about winning or losing anymore. It was about proving that sometimes the human spirit can overcome what doctors put in medical charts. That faith and determination can rewrite the story that others try to tell about you. The finish line stretched ahead like a promise he'd been chasing his whole life, and every stride carried the prayers of a community that had learned to believe in miracles. This was the moment when everything would change, when the boy they once called slow would either vindicate years of silent suffering or face the crushing weight of dreams deferred. Hello my friends. Before we continue our story, leave your like, share the story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Riverside, Ohio, wasn't the kind of place that produced state champions in anything except maybe high school football. And even that hadn't happened since 1987. The town of 8,400 souls sat 30 miles southeast of Dayton, surrounded by cornfields and auto parts factories, where most families had roots going back 3 generations, and Friday night lights at Riverside High were the biggest entertainment for miles. The Doyle family lived in a modest ranch house on Maple Street, where Marcus had spent the first 8 years of his life, struggling with what doctors clinically called developmental coordination disorder, a fancy term that meant his brain and body didn't always communicate the way they should. His mama, Denise, worked the overnight shift at the Ford plant, coming home exhausted, but always finding energy to help Marcus with his physical therapy exercises on the living room carpet. Marcus Doyle had been different from the start, though his parents didn't fully understand what that meant until he started school. While other kids ran and played tag effortlessly, Marcus moved like he was thinking through every step, his arms and legs not quite in sync, stumbling over his own feet during simple games of kickball. The other children weren't cruel, exactly, but kids have a way of stating obvious truths without filters. Why is Marcus so slow? They'd asked during recess, not realizing how those words carved themselves into a young boy's heart. His father, Jerome, a quiet man who drove delivery trucks for a living, would spend evenings in the backyard with Marcus, patiently throwing a tennis ball and watching his son's delayed reactions, never showing frustration but silently wondering if his boy would ever catch up to his peers. The Doyle family wasn't wealthy. Jerome's truck driving salary and Denise's factory wages barely covered the mortgage and Marcus's therapy sessions, but they were rich in the kind of stubborn faith that characterized working-class Ohio families. Every Tuesday and Thursday after school, Denise would drive Marcus 30 minutes to Dayton Children's Hospital, where a physical therapist named Mrs. Patterson worked with him on basic coordination drills that other kids mastered without thinking. Marcus would practice walking heel-to-toe across balance beams, catching tennis balls thrown from different angles, and performing simple jumping exercises that left him sweating and discouraged. The insurance covered some of the sessions, but the copays added up, forcing the family to cut corners in other areas: generic groceries, secondhand clothes, and no cable television. At Riverside Elementary, Marcus became known as the kid who tried hard but just couldn't keep up, whether it was in PE class or playground games during recess. His teachers were kind but concerned, often pulling Denise aside during parent conferences to discuss his motor planning issues and suggesting additional interventions. The school's pay teacher, Coach Williams, was a former college athlete who understood that some kids developed at different paces, but even he struggled to find activities where Marcus could succeed. During track and field day in 3rd grade, Marcus finished dead last in every event he entered, including a simple 50-yard dash, where he tripped over his own feet halfway through and had to walk the rest of the way. The other kids clapped politely when he finally crossed the finish line, but Marcus could see pity in their eyes, and that hurt worse than any physical stumble. The turning point came during the spring of Marcus's 4th grade year, when Mrs. Patterson suggested he might benefit from a different approach to physical therapy. Instead of focusing on the things he couldn't do well, she proposed channeling his determination into something that might eventually become a strength. She'd noticed that despite his coordination issues, Marcus had an unusual pain tolerance and never quit during their sessions, no matter how frustrated he became. "Some kids are natural athletes," she told Denise after one particularly challenging session. "But some kids have something deeper, they have heart." She suggested that Marcus might respond well to repetitive, structured activities where he could gradually build muscle memory and confidence. That summer, Jerome started taking Marcus to the high school track in the evenings. Not to train seriously, but just to run together and enjoy some father-son time. Marcus couldn't run fast or with good form, but something about the oval track appealed to him: the clear boundaries, the straightforward goal of getting from point A to point B, the way his own effort was the only thing that mattered. Jog slowly around the quarter-mile loop, Jerome matching his son's pace and talking about everything except running baseball games. School friends, what Marcus wanted to be when he grew up. During those quiet evenings on the track, with the Ohio sun setting behind the bleachers and no one watching except the occasional dog walker, Marcus began to feel something he'd rarely experienced: the simple joy of movement without judgment. By the end of that summer, Marcus was running the entire 4-lap mile without stopping. Though his form was still awkward and his time would have made track coaches cringe. But for the first time in his life, he was doing something physical that he genuinely enjoyed. Something where his effort directly translated to improvement, even if that improvement was measured in seconds rather than minutes. Jerome noticed that his son seemed more confident overall, standing a little straighter in school photos and speaking up more during family dinner conversations. When Mrs. Patterson heard about their evening runs during their next therapy session, she smiled and made a note in Marcus's file: patient showing improved gross motor coordination and increased confidence through self-directed physical activity. The invitation came during Marcus's sophomore year at Riverside High. Delivered by Coach Tom Bradley in the hallway between 2nd and 3rd period on a Tuesday morning in March. Coach Bradley was a legend in Central Ohio, former Division II sprinter who'd been coaching track and field for 22 years and had sent 3 kids to state championships during his tenure. He was also known for his ability to spot potential in unlikely places, which is why he'd been quietly watching Marcus during mandatory PE classes. "Doyle," he called out as Marcus hurried toward his English classroom. Books clutched against his chest in that awkward way that still marked him as different from his more coordinated classmates. "Got a minute to talk?" Coach Bradley's weathered face showed the kind of serious expression that made Marcus wonder if he was in trouble for something. Standing there in the hallway with students rushing past them, Coach Bradley delivered news that would change everything. "I've been watching you run during Miller's pay class, and I think you've got something special brewing under that unusual stride of yours." Marcus almost laughed, thinking the coach was making some kind of joke after all. He was still the kid who'd finished last in elementary school races, still the one who got picked for teams only after everyone else had been chosen. But Coach Bradley wasn't smiling. "Your form's a mess, don't get me wrong, but you've got natural leg turnover, and you don't quit when it hurts. I've seen kids with perfect technique who don't have half your motor." He paused, studying Marcus's face for a reaction. "Track season starts next week. I want you to come out for sprints." The conversation that night at the Doyle dinner table was charged with excitement and anxiety in equal measure. Denise nearly dropped her fork when Marcus shared Coach Bradley's invitation, and Jerome sat back in his chair with the expression of a man trying to process unexpected news. "Sprint team," Denise repeated, as if saying the words might help them. "Make sense? Baby, you know we support you in everything, but are you sure you heard him right?" The family had grown accustomed to Marcus being good at academic subjects and showing improvement in his coordination, but the idea of him competing in track events still seemed like a stretch. Marcus nodded vigorously, explaining how Coach Bradley had compared his leg turnover to other runners and mentioned something about natural talent that just needed proper development. The financial reality hit the family immediately, as it always did when new opportunities arose. Track season meant equipment costs, proper running spikes, team warm-ups, entry fees for meets, and potentially travel expenses if Marcus proved good enough to compete at higher levels. Jerome worked overtime calculations in his head, while Denise mentally reviewed their monthly budget, wondering what expenses they could cut to make room for their son's athletic aspirations. "We'll figure out the money part," Jerome finally said, reaching across the table to squeeze Marcus's shoulder. "If Coach Bradley sees something in you, then we're going to give you every chance to see how far you can take it." That night, Denise called her supervisor at the Ford plant to inquire about picking up additional weekend shifts. Marcus's first track practice was a humbling experience that nearly ended his athletic career before it began. Surrounded by naturally gifted athletes who moved with the fluid grace he'd always envied, Marcus felt like an imposter wearing borrowed spikes that were half a size too big. During the initial 100-meter time trial, he ran a 13.2 seconds, respectable for an untrained sophomore, but more than 2 seconds slower than the team's current fastest sprinter, a senior named Damon Waters, who'd been running since middle school. The other sprinters were polite but clearly puzzled by Coach Bradley's decision to recruit someone with no track background and an unconventional running style that looked more like controlled falling than efficient sprinting. Coach Bradley, however, saw something in Marcus's performance that others missed. During the cool-down jog after practice, he pulled Marcus aside and delivered an assessment that was both encouraging and realistic. "Son, you ran that 100 in 13.2, which ain't bad for someone who's never trained properly, but more importantly, you looked relaxed doing it." He explained that many new runners tense up and fight against their own bodies, but Marcus had maintained loose shoulders and efficient breathing even while pushing hard. "Your stride's too long right now and your arm action needs work, but those are fixable problems. What I can't teach is the ability to stay calm under pressure, and you've got that naturally." He outlined a training plan that would focus on gradually improving Marcus's technique while building on his existing strengths. The first month of training was a daily lesson in delayed gratification, with Marcus showing up at 6 a.m. for additional technique work before regular practice. Coach Bradley had him running shorter distances, 40 and 60 meter sprints, focusing on proper starting positions and efficient acceleration rather than raw speed. Marcus's times dropped slowly but consistently: 13.0, then 12.8, then 12.6. Each improvement representing hours of repetitive drills and patient instruction. His teammates began to notice the dedication, if not yet the results, with senior captain Damon Waters offering encouragement and technique tips during water breaks. The other sprinters started including Marcus in their pre-practice jokes and post-workout discussions, accepting him as a legitimate member of the group rather than a charity case. The breakthrough moment came during Marcus's 6th week of training, in a practice session that started like any other, but ended with everyone on the track stopping to stare. Coach Bradley had set up blocks for starting practice, and Marcus, who'd been struggling with his explosive first steps, suddenly found the rhythm he'd been searching for. His first stride out of the blocks was powerful and perfectly timed. His second stride maintained that momentum, and by the time he crossed the 40-meter mark, he was moving with a fluidity that surprised everyone, including himself. The stopwatch read 5.1 seconds for the 40-meter split, a time that would translate to roughly 11.8 seconds for 100 meters if he could maintain that pace. Coach Bradley didn't say anything immediately, just reset the blocks and had Marcus run it again. 5.0 seconds. Then 4.9. Something fundamental had clicked, and everyone could see it. The first real test came at the Riverside County Championships in early May, where Marcus would face competition from 12 other high schools in a meet that served as a preview for the regional qualifying events. Despite weeks of improved practice times, Marcus had never raced against anyone except his own teammates, and the mental pressure of competing in front of strangers felt completely different from the comfortable environment of daily training. His mama and daddy sat in the bleachers wearing nervous smiles and brand new Riverside High t-shirts, while his little sister Keisha held a homemade sign that read "Go Marcus" in rainbow-colored markers. The other sprinters warming up on the track looked impossibly fast and confident, going through elaborate pre-race rituals that Marcus had never learned. Coach Bradley walked Marcus through his race strategy during warm-ups, emphasizing the importance of staying relaxed and running his own race rather than getting caught up in what the other runners were doing. "Don't look left or right during the race," he instructed, adjusting Marcus's starting blocks for the third time. "Eyes forward, trust your training, and remember that you belong here just as much as anyone else." Marcus nodded, but his stomach was churning with anxiety he'd never experienced during practice sessions. When the clerk called the 100-meter field to the line, Marcus walked to lane 6, feeling like he was moving through thick water. His legs suddenly heavy despite the extensive warm-up routine. The race itself was a blur of sensory overload. Starters' commands echoing through the stadium speakers, the crowd noise building to a crescendo, the sharp crack of the pistol that seemed to freeze time for a split second before 8 runners exploded forward. Marcus got a decent start, but found himself trailing the field by the 20-meter mark, watching the other runners pull away with a sinking feeling that he'd overestimated his own abilities. But somewhere around the 60-meter mark, something shifted. His stride lengthened naturally. His breathing settled into the rhythm he'd practiced hundreds of times, and suddenly he was passing runners instead of falling behind them. He crossed the finish line in 4th place with a time of 12.1 seconds, a personal best by half a second and fast enough to turn heads among the coaches watching from the infield. The performance at Counties earned Marcus respect from his teammates and recognition from local media, but it also brought unwanted attention from competitors who began studying his technique and race tactics. During the following week's training sessions, Coach Bradley noticed that Marcus was pressing too hard, trying to improve everything at once instead of focusing on gradual development. Success can be just as dangerous as failure if you don't handle it right. The coach warned during a particularly frustrating practice where Marcus's times had actually gotten worse. Despite increased effort, the pressure was coming from multiple directions: teammates expecting him to get faster every week, parents hoping their investment in equipment and travel would pay off, and Marcus himself struggling with the gap between his ambitions and his current abilities. The academic demands of sophomore year complicated Marcus's training schedule, particularly in advanced math and science courses where he couldn't afford to let his grades slip. If he wanted to maintain eligibility for track competition, late-night study sessions after 2-hour track practices left him exhausted, and his mother worried about the toll the double schedule was taking on his still-developing body. During one particularly challenging week in mid-May, Marcus fell asleep during third-period chemistry class and nearly missed an important lab assignment. His chemistry teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, kept him after class for a conversation about time management and priorities that made Marcus question whether he was spreading himself too thin. The injury happened during a routine sprint drill on a Thursday afternoon in late May, when Marcus felt something pop in his left hamstring, just as he was hitting full stride in a 60-meter run. The pain was immediate and sharp, dropping him to the track like he'd been shot, while his teammates and coach Bradley rushed to help him off the synthetic surface. The athletic trainer's initial assessment was cautiously optimistic. A grade 1 strain that would heal with proper rest, but the timing couldn't have been worse. With regional championships just 3 weeks away, Marcus spent the next week in physical therapy sessions that felt uncomfortably similar to his childhood coordination training, working with resistance bands and ice treatments while watching his teammates continue their preparation for the biggest meet of the season. The mental challenge of being injured proved harder than the physical rehabilitation. As Marcus lay awake at night, wondering if his breakthrough season was over before it had really begun, his parents tried to remain supportive, but he could see the worry in their eyes, worry about the money they'd invested, worry about his emotional state if he couldn't compete, worry about whether this setback might permanently damage his confidence. During his darkest moment, sitting in the training room with an ice pack strapped to his leg while listening to his teammates practice outside, Marcus called his childhood physical therapist, Mrs. Patterson. "Sometimes our greatest victories come after our most difficult challenges," she reminded him over the phone. "You've overcome bigger obstacles than this, Marcus. Trust the process." The comeback began exactly 10 days after the injury, with Marcus jogging slowly around the track while his teammates ran full-speed workouts. Coach Bradley designed a modified training program that emphasized technique and mental preparation rather than maximum effort, gradually building Marcus's confidence along with his physical readiness. By the third day back, Marcus was running stride outs at 75% effort, and by the end of the week, he was hitting practice times that suggested he might actually be ready for regional competition. The injury had cost him some fitness, but it had also taught him something valuable about resilience and the difference between running hurt and running injured. When Coach Bradley finally cleared him for full competition the day before regionals, Marcus felt stronger mentally than he had all season. The revelation came not during a dramatic practice session or an inspiring pep talk, but during a quiet Sunday afternoon in late May when Marcus was helping his father change the oil in their aging Chevy pickup. Jerome had been unusually quiet all morning, occasionally glancing at his son with the expression of a man working through complicated thoughts. Finally, as they sat on the front porch waiting for the oil to drain, Jerome cleared his throat and began talking about his own high school experience, how he'd been a decent basketball player who never quite had the confidence to believe he could compete at higher levels, how he'd spent years wondering what might have happened if he'd pushed himself harder. "The difference between you and me," Jerome said, wiping his hands on an old shop rag, "is that you keep fighting even when things get tough. That hamstring injury could have ended your season, but here you are, getting ready for regionals." Marcus had never heard his father talk so openly about regret and missed opportunities, and something about the conversation shifted his perspective on his own athletic journey. For months, he'd been focused on proving himself to coaches, teammates, and skeptics who remembered the clumsy kid from elementary school. But his father's words helped him realize that the only person he really needed to prove anything to was himself. The pressure he'd been feeling wasn't coming from external expectations, it was coming from his own fear of failing, his own doubt about whether he deserved to be competing at this level. That night, Marcus sat in his bedroom, looking at the regional championship heat sheets, and realized that regardless of what happened in the race, he'd already accomplished something remarkable by overcoming his developmental challenges and earning the right to compete. The next morning's training session felt different from the moment Marcus stepped onto the track. Instead of the nervous energy that had characterized his recent workouts, he felt calm and focused, moving through his warm-up routine with the easy confidence of someone who belonged exactly where he was. Coach Bradley noticed the change immediately, commenting on Marcus's relaxed shoulders and smooth stride during technique drills. When they ran a final time trial controlled 100-meter run at 90% effort, Marcus crossed the line in 11.7 seconds, a time that would have seemed impossible just 6 months earlier. More importantly, the run felt effortless. Like his body was finally operating the way it had always been designed to work. The community support that had been building quietly throughout the season became impossible to ignore during the week. Leading up to regionals, local newspaper reporter Janet Mills wrote a feature story about Marcus's journey from physical therapy to track success. And suddenly, everyone in Riverside seemed to know about the upcoming race. The barbershop, where Jerome got his haircut, displayed a poster wishing Marcus good luck. The grocery store manager asked Denise for updates on her son's training. And even Marcus's former elementary school teachers were talking about their plans to watch the meet. The attention was flattering, but also intimidating, as Marcus realized that his performance would be representing not just himself and his team, but an entire community that had embraced his story. Coach Bradley spent Thursday's practice session working with Marcus on race visualization and mental preparation, techniques that felt surprisingly familiar to someone who'd spent years in physical therapy learning to coordinate complex movements. They practiced different race scenarios, getting out slow and needing to close hard, being in the lead at the halfway point, dealing with the pressure of running in an outside lane where he couldn't see the other competitors. The coach emphasized that Marcus's biggest advantage was his ability to stay relaxed under pressure, a skill that had been developed through years of performing coordination exercises while other people watched and evaluated his progress. "You've been dealing with pressure your whole life," Coach Bradley reminded him. "This is just another test, and you've already passed harder ones." The breakthrough in Marcus's mental approach came during Friday's light workout, when he suddenly understood that his developmental challenges hadn't been obstacles to overcome. They'd been preparation for exactly this kind of moment. Every frustrating physical therapy session had taught him patience and persistence. Every childhood experience of being different had developed his mental toughness. Every time he'd been underestimated had motivated him to work harder than anyone expected. As he ran through his final practice sprints, Marcus felt the pieces of his athletic journey clicking into place like a puzzle that had always been meant to fit together this way. The kid they used to call slow was still there, but now he was also something else, a competitor who belonged on the same track as anyone in the state. The final piece of preparation came from an unexpected source, his little sister, Keisha, who approached him Friday evening with a gift she'd been working on in secret. It was a small wooden carving of a runner in full stride, made in her middle school shop class with help from her teacher, Mr. Peterson. "I wanted you to have something to remember that you're fast now," she said, pressing the carving into his hands, "but also to remember that we always knew you were special, even when other people didn't see it." Marcus turned the wooden figure over in his hands, feeling the smooth craftsmanship and seeing his sister's pride reflected in every carefully sanded surface. He realized that his journey had never been just about him, it had been about his family's faith, his community's support, and the collective belief that sometimes the most unlikely stories turn out to be the most meaningful ones. The night before regionals, Marcus went to bed early but couldn't sleep, his mind cycling through race strategies and technical reminders. Around midnight, he gave up trying to force sleep and instead sat by his bedroom window, looking out at the quiet streets of Riverside and thinking about all the people who would be cheering for him the next day. He thought about Mrs. Patterson, who'd helped him learn to coordinate his movements when simple walking was a challenge. He thought about Coach Bradley, who'd seen potential where others saw only limitations. He thought about his parents, who'd sacrificed financially and emotionally to give him every opportunity to succeed. Most of all, he thought about the younger version of himself who'd struggled through elementary school PE classes, wondering if that boy could have imagined this moment. The answer was probably no. But that was okay. Sometimes the best destinations are the ones you never knew you were traveling toward. ****. The regional championship meet was held at Ohio Wesleyan University in Delaware, Ohio, on a perfect Saturday afternoon in early June, with temperatures in the mid-70s and just enough breeze to keep the flags fluttering above the stadium. Marcus arrived 3 hours before his race, partly because Coach Bradley insisted on extensive warm-up time, but mostly because his nervous energy made it impossible to sit still at home. The facility was more impressive than anything he'd competed in before: an 8-lane track with professional timing equipment, stadium seating for several thousand spectators, and warm-up areas where athletes from across central Ohio were preparing for their respective events. As Marcus walked through the athlete check-in area, he overheard coaches discussing his recent times and debating whether the Riverside kid was a legitimate threat or just a feel-good story. The competition field for the 100-meter dash included some of the fastest high school sprinters in Ohio, led by defending regional champion Deshaun Williams from Columbus West, who'd run 10.8 seconds earlier in the season and was considered a lock for the state meet. Marcus studied the heat sheets and realized he'd been placed in lane 3. Right in the middle of the action, which Coach Bradley explained was actually advantageous because he'd be able to see most of his competitors during the race. The other runners warming up nearby looked impossibly fast and confident, going through elaborate pre-race rituals involving specific stretching sequences, multiple pairs of spikes, and detailed discussions with their coaches about race tactics. Marcus felt simultaneously intimidated and oddly calm, like he was watching everything from slightly outside his own body. The moment that changed everything happened during warm-ups, when Marcus ran his final practice start and felt something click into place that had never quite been right before. His first step out of the blocks was explosive and perfectly balanced. His acceleration phase was smooth and powerful, and by the time he shut down at the 60-meter mark, every coach on the infield was staring at their stopwatches with surprised expressions. Coach Bradley didn't say anything about the split time, but Marcus could see excitement in his eyes, mixed with the kind of nervous anticipation that suggested the practice run had been significantly faster than expected. As they walked back to the team area, Marcus overheard Columbus West's coach asking someone, "Who's the kid in lane 3?" The conversation stopped when they noticed Marcus was within earshot. But the damage was done. He was no longer flying under anyone's radar. The call room experience was unlike anything Marcus had faced in high school competition. With 8 runners sitting in uncomfortable silence while officials checked their spikes and reviewed competition rules, Deshaun Williams looked relaxed and confident, chatting casually with the runner next to him about college recruiting visits and summer training plans. Marcus focused on his breathing and tried to stay loose, occasionally rotating his ankles and flexing his fingers the way Coach Bradley had taught him. When the official announced it was time to head to the track, Marcus felt his heart rate spike, but his mind remained clear. This was just another race. Just another opportunity to see how fast he could cover 100 meters. Just another chance to prove that the kid they used to call slow had found his speed. Walking onto the track for introductions, Marcus was surprised by the size of the crowd and the volume of the cheers when his name was announced. He spotted his family immediately. They were impossible to miss, with Denise standing and applauding enthusiastically while Jerome held up a sign that read, "That's my boy." In block letters, his teammates from Riverside were clustered together. In the student section, Andy could see people throughout the stands wearing the school's red and white colors. The support was overwhelming in the best possible way, reminding Marcus that he was carrying more than just his own dreams into this race. As he walked to his blocks in lane 3, he touched the small wooden carving his sister had made, tucked safely in the pocket of his warm-up jacket. The pre-race routine felt like it was happening in slow motion and at hyperspeed simultaneously. Marcus set his blocks with the precision Coach Bradley had drilled into him thousands of times, tested his starts twice to make sure the spacing felt right, then stood and began his final mental preparation. He looked down at the lane in front of him, 100 meters of red synthetic track that would determine whether his breakthrough season continued or ended right here. To his left was Deshaun Williams, stretching casually and looking like he was getting ready for a practice run rather than the most important race of the season. To his right was a runner from Springfield who'd been consistently fast all season but was considered a long shot for one of the 3 qualifying spots for state. Marcus realized that in about 60 seconds, everything would be decided. The starters, Commands came with military precision. Runners, to your marks. Marcus settled into his blocks, feeling the familiar pressure of the starting blocks against his feet, and the rough texture of the track surface under his fingertips. He raised his hips and shifted his weight forward. Every muscle in his body coiled and ready to explode forward at the sound of the gun. The stadium fell completely silent except for the sound of 8 runners breathing heavily and the distant hum of electronic timing equipment. Marcus felt time stretch and compress simultaneously. This moment had taken years to reach, but it would be over in less than 11 seconds. When the starter's pistol cracked, Marcus didn't hear it so much as feel it. And suddenly, he was moving faster than he'd ever moved in his life. The race unfolded like a carefully choreographed sequence that Marcus had visualized hundreds of times but was experiencing for the first time. His start was clean and powerful, putting him even with the field through the first 20 meters. At the 40-meter mark, he was in 3rd place and feeling relaxed. His stride, finding the rhythm that Coach Bradley had, helped him develop over months of technical work. Somewhere around 60 meters, Marcus realized he was no longer running behind anyone. He was matched, stride for stride, with Deshaun Williams, and the two of them had separated from the rest of the field. The crowd noise was building to a crescendo, but Marcus could barely hear it over the sound of his own breathing and the rhythmic pounding of spikes against track surface. With 20 meters to go, Williams tried to pull away, but Marcus responded by lengthening his stride and increasing his arm speed. Techniques that felt as natural as breathing after months of repetitive practice. The finish line came up faster than Marcus expected, and for a moment, he wasn't sure who had won. The race had been so close that he couldn't tell from his position in lane 3 whether he'd edged ahead or fallen just short. He jogged through his cooldown while the officials reviewed the photo finish, trying to read the expressions on the faces of coaches and spectators for clues about the result. Coach Bradley jogged over with a poker face that gave nothing away, but when he got close enough to speak privately, he grabbed Marcus by the shoulders and delivered the news that would change everything. 10.94 seconds. You won. The number didn't register immediately. Marcus had been hoping to break 11.5 seconds and maybe sneak into a qualifying spot for state. But 10.94 was fast enough to win the regional championship and announce himself as a legitimate contender. At the state level, the immediate aftermath of Marcus's victory was a blur of celebration, interviews, and disbelief that would take weeks to fully process. As he stood on the podium wearing the regional champion's medal, Marcus could see his parents in the stands with tears streaming down their faces, and his sister, Keisha, jumping up and down while holding her homemade sign. Coach Bradley stood nearby with the satisfied expression of someone who'd bet on a long shot and watched it pay off, but also with the knowledge that this victory was just the beginning of a much larger story. Local reporters wanted to know about Marcus's training regimen and his goals for the state championship, but all he could think about was how far he'd traveled from those frustrating elementary school PE classes where he couldn't even run in a straight line without stumbling. The ripple effects of Marcus's breakthrough extended far beyond his own athletic achievements, touching everyone who'd been part of his journey from developmental delays to regional champion. Mrs. Patterson received a phone call from Denise Doyle that evening, sharing the news with the physical therapist who'd first suggested that Marcus's determination might eventually become his greatest strength. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, with both women marveling at how a boy who'd struggled with basic coordination had developed into one of the fastest sprinters in Ohio. Jerome took a week of vacation time from his trucking job to travel with the team to the state championship, something he'd never done for any recreational activity, but felt was essential now that his son was competing at the highest level of high school athletics. The life lessons Marcus learned through his track journey became a source of inspiration for younger athletes throughout Central Ohio, particularly kids who were dealing with their own physical or learning challenges. During the weeks following regionals, he received letters from elementary school students who'd heard his story and wanted to share their own struggles with coordination, confidence, or fitting in with their peers. Marcus realized that his victory represented something larger than individual athletic achievement. It was proof that persistence and proper support could help people overcome limitations that seemed permanent. Coach Bradley started using Marcus's story during recruitment visits, not just to attract fast runners, but to identify kids who had the character to work through difficult periods and emerge stronger. The transformation in how Marcus saw himself was perhaps the most significant outcome of his championship season. As he'd learned to separate his identity from other people's expectations and judgments, the boy who'd been called slow throughout elementary school was still part of who he was, but that experience had become a source of strength rather than shame. He understood now that his early struggles had developed mental toughness and work ethic that many naturally gifted athletes never needed to cultivate. When younger kids asked him for advice about dealing with being different or overcoming challenges, Marcus would tell them that sometimes the qualities that make you feel like an outsider are exactly the qualities that will eventually make you special. The community of Riverside embraced Marcus's success as validation of their collective belief in supporting underdogs and celebrating effort as much as achievement. The local newspaper ran a follow-up story about how the entire town had rallied around Marcus's track career. From the barbershop owner who'd displayed good luck signs to the grocery store employees who'd asked Denise for updates after every meet. The story resonated beyond the town borders, reaching people throughout Ohio who saw Marcus's journey as a reminder that greatness can emerge from the most unexpected places. His success became part of Riverside's identity, proof that a small town's faith in one of its own could help create something extraordinary. Looking back on his transformation from a boy with developmental coordination disorder to a regional champion sprinter, Marcus understood that the real victory hadn't been crossing the finish line first, it had been learning to believe in himself, despite years of evidence suggesting he was different from everyone else. The wooden carving his sister had made still sat on his bedroom dresser, a daily reminder that speed was just one measure of a person's worth, and that the most meaningful victories often come after the longest struggles. As he prepared for the state championship meet, Marcus carried with him not just the technical skills Coach Bradley had taught him, but the deeper knowledge that sometimes the people who take the longest to find their stride are the ones who run the strongest when it matters most. The boy they used to call slow had found his speed, but more importantly, he'd found his voice, his confidence, and his place in a world that had once seemed designed for everyone except him. And in discovering his own strength, Marcus Doyle had given hope to every kid who'd ever been told they weren't fast enough, coordinated enough, or talented enough to chase their dreams, proving that sometimes the greatest victories belong to those who are never supposed to win at all.